In this episode, we move into one of the most practical and useful skills in the Certified in Risk and Information Systems Control (C-RISC) journey, because this is the point where separate pieces of risk information begin turning into a story the business can actually understand. By now, you have already worked through risk events, contributing conditions, impacts, threats, vulnerabilities, and control deficiencies, but those ideas become far more powerful when they are brought together in a structured way. That is exactly what risk scenario development is meant to do. A strong risk scenario does not exaggerate danger, and it does not drift into vague language that means almost anything. Instead, it describes a plausible chain of events that shows how something harmful could happen, what conditions make it possible, what business objective could be affected, and why leadership should care enough to decide what happens next. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A useful place to begin is with the meaning of a risk scenario, because beginners often hear the word scenario and think of a dramatic story or an imaginary disaster exercise. In risk management, a scenario is not fantasy and it is not theater. It is a structured description of how a risk could unfold in a real business environment under realistic conditions. That means it connects causes, weaknesses, affected assets or processes, and likely consequences into one coherent picture. A risk event tells you what harmful thing might happen, but a risk scenario gives that event context and movement. It explains how the problem begins, what helps it progress, what it touches, and what kind of result follows. This matters because leadership usually makes better decisions when risk is described as a plausible business situation rather than as a disconnected technical finding. A weak password policy may sound abstract, but a scenario describing how credential theft could lead to unauthorized financial transactions and regulatory reporting duties feels much more real and much easier to assess. The main reason risk scenarios matter is that organizations rarely struggle because they lack raw information. More often, they struggle because they have fragments of information sitting in different places that have not yet been connected into something leadership can use. One team knows about a vulnerability, another knows about process weakness, another understands legal obligations, and another feels the operational pressure that would make an event harder to contain. Scenario development brings those fragments together and asks what they mean when combined. This is important because risk management is not only about identifying isolated issues. It is about understanding how different conditions can align and what the resulting business consequences might be. When an organization develops scenarios well, it becomes easier to compare risks, assign ownership, explain urgency, and support treatment decisions. Without scenarios, many discussions remain too vague for good prioritization. With scenarios, the business starts to see exposure in a way that is concrete enough to guide judgment without pretending to predict the future perfectly. A strong risk scenario usually contains a few essential elements, even when the wording varies from one organization to another. It needs to identify the source of harm, which may be an attacker, an internal mistake, a third-party failure, or an environmental disruption. It should describe the asset, process, service, or objective that could be affected. It should also include the conditions that make the event plausible, such as weak controls, fragile dependencies, poor visibility, unclear ownership, or time pressure that encourages shortcuts. Then it needs to explain the event itself and the likely result if the event succeeds or persists. Finally, it should connect the situation to business impact, whether that means operational interruption, financial loss, regulatory exposure, customer harm, reputational damage, or some combination of those outcomes. These elements matter because they prevent the scenario from becoming either too technical or too general. The scenario should be specific enough to be meaningful and broad enough to show why the issue matters beyond the immediate system where the problem begins. One of the best habits in scenario development is starting from business objectives rather than from technical components alone. A new learner often wants to begin with the system, the server, or the application, and there is nothing wrong with understanding the technology. Still, The most useful scenario work begins by asking what the business is trying to achieve and what could interfere with that success. If the organization depends on revenue from online transactions, patient safety in a healthcare setting, accurate financial reporting, reliable product delivery, or protection of sensitive customer data, those objectives should shape the scenario from the beginning. This does not mean technology becomes unimportant. It means the technology is understood in relation to the business result it supports. A payment platform matters because orders must be processed. An identity service matters because multiple essential workflows depend on trust in access decisions. A customer database matters because privacy, service continuity, and legal obligations may all depend on how that information is handled. Starting from objectives keeps scenarios aligned with real organizational priorities instead of turning them into disconnected technical narratives. Evidence also plays a major role in good scenario development, because strong scenarios should be grounded in reality rather than built from fear or guesswork. Analysts may use incident history, audit findings, vulnerability reviews, architecture discussions, business process documentation, operational metrics, third-party assessments, and interviews with people who understand how work is actually performed. Each source contributes a different part of the picture. Historical incidents may show what kinds of events have already occurred or nearly occurred. Technical reviews may reveal weaknesses in design or configuration. Business owners may explain which delays are survivable and which would create serious downstream harm. Legal or compliance stakeholders may identify reporting duties or contractual commitments that become relevant if a certain kind of event occurs. When those views are combined thoughtfully, the scenario becomes more credible and more useful. It does not need to be perfect to be valuable, but it should be plausible enough that decision makers can recognize the risk as something worthy of serious attention rather than as a theoretical exercise disconnected from operations. Another important part of scenario development is tracing the pathway from beginning to consequence, because a risk scenario is not just a list of facts. It is a description of progression. Something triggers the event, something allows it to continue, and something of business value is ultimately affected. That path may be simple in some cases and more layered in others, but it should make sense when read from start to finish. For example, an attacker may gain access through stolen credentials, take advantage of weak privilege controls, and reach a sensitive business application that supports financial processing. A change management failure may begin with rushed deployment, interact with weak testing and unclear approval, and lead to disruption in a customer-facing service during a critical period. By tracing the path this way, the scenario helps people understand not only what the problem is, but how the risk actually moves through the environment. This is helpful because many organizations can identify weaknesses without fully understanding how those weaknesses connect to a harmful business result. The path gives shape to that connection. Contributing conditions deserve careful attention during scenario development because they often explain why an event is plausible in one environment and less plausible in another. Two organizations may face the same broad threat, yet one experiences serious disruption while the other absorbs the issue with far less damage. The difference often lies in the surrounding conditions. Weak monitoring, outdated technology, limited segmentation, inconsistent review practices, staffing shortages, fragile vendor dependencies, poor training, and unclear accountability can all increase the chance that a risk event occurs or worsens once it begins. A strong scenario does not simply mention these conditions as background detail. It uses them to show why the story is realistic and why the business should take the exposure seriously. This also helps support later treatment decisions, because if a scenario reveals that poor visibility and weak ownership are amplifying the risk, leadership can respond more intelligently than if it only sees the visible symptom. Scenario development is therefore not just about describing harm. It is also about exposing the environment that makes that harm more credible. A useful scenario must also address consequence clearly, because scenarios exist to support decisions, and leaders need to understand what the organization stands to lose. Consequence may include direct financial loss, service interruption, delayed operations, contractual penalties, regulatory obligations, fraud, recovery expense, or damage to customer trust. In some settings, it may also include safety concerns or strategic setbacks that reach far beyond the immediate incident. The most effective scenarios do not stop at vague phrases like significant impact or major disruption. They explain what kind of disruption is expected and why it matters to the organization's goals. A delayed payroll process, a blocked order workflow, inaccurate reporting to management, prolonged unavailability of a core service, or exposure of regulated personal data all create different types of impact and require different kinds of attention. By being more specific about consequence, the scenario becomes more useful for prioritization and communication. It also becomes easier to compare one scenario with another because the business effect is described in terms leadership can understand rather than in purely technical language. Likelihood is another piece of the scenario picture, even though scenario development is not the same as formal risk rating. A scenario should reflect something plausible rather than merely imaginable. That means the organization should think carefully about how realistic the path to harm actually is based on current controls, historical events, threat activity, process maturity, and environmental conditions. A good scenario is not the most extreme thing a person can invent. It is a disciplined statement about what could reasonably happen if certain weaknesses and triggers align. This distinction is important because risk work loses credibility when every scenario sounds like the end of the world. At the same time, credibility also suffers when scenarios are written so mildly that they hide meaningful danger. Strong scenario development therefore requires balance. It should be serious without becoming theatrical and realistic without becoming complacent. The best scenarios help leaders see that an event is plausible enough to deserve thoughtful consideration, even if the exact timing or details cannot be predicted in advance. There are many ways to write scenarios, but the strongest ones tend to be concise, specific, and easy to follow when read aloud or discussed in a meeting. They are not overloaded with every possible detail, and they are not so brief that they lose meaning. A common weakness is writing a scenario that sounds like a vague category instead of a real business situation. For example, saying there is risk of cyber attack does not help much because it does not identify the pathway, the affected objective, or the likely consequence. A stronger scenario would explain that a third-party support account with excessive privileges could be misused or compromised, leading to unauthorized changes in a customer-facing system and resulting in service disruption and contractual penalties during peak demand. That version gives leadership something to think about. It identifies the source, the weakness, the affected area, and the business effect in a way that supports actual discussion. Good scenario writing is therefore a communication skill as much as an analytical one, because the scenario has to be understandable to people who may not share the same technical vocabulary. Common mistakes in scenario development are worth noticing early because they weaken both exam reasoning and real-world practice. One mistake is making the scenario too broad, which creates language that sounds important but is hard to assess or act on. Another is making it too technical, which may satisfy specialists while leaving business leaders unclear about why the risk matters. Some teams also build scenarios that describe only the threat and the weakness without explaining the business consequence, while others jump straight to consequence without showing why the event is credible in the first place. Another frequent problem is writing best-case or worst-case stories instead of plausible stories. A best-case story understates risk and hides the real concern, while a worst-case story can sound exaggerated and reduce trust in the assessment process. There is also a tendency to write scenarios in a static way, as if the risk appears fully formed without a path or progression. Strong scenarios avoid these traps by staying grounded, specific, and balanced, while clearly linking cause, condition, event, and impact. Risk scenarios become especially valuable when they are connected to later outputs such as the risk register, assessment results, reporting discussions, and treatment planning. Once a scenario is developed well, it provides a stable way to discuss exposure across different stakeholders. Business owners can see what objective is threatened. Technical teams can understand the conditions that need attention. Compliance and legal teams can see what obligations may be triggered. Leadership can compare the scenario to other business concerns and decide whether the risk should be accepted, mitigated, transferred, or avoided. In this way, scenario development supports consistency across the entire risk process. It keeps the organization from treating one issue as a scanner alert, another as a vendor complaint, and another as an audit finding with no shared structure connecting them. Instead, each issue can be understood as a business-relevant scenario that ties together evidence, causation, impact, and ownership. That makes the overall risk picture more coherent and far easier to communicate to decision-makers under real business pressure. By the end of this discussion, the main idea should be clear that risk scenario development is the work of turning scattered risk information into a credible, structured description of how harm could unfold in the organization. A strong scenario identifies the source of danger, the affected objective or asset, the conditions that make the event plausible, the path the event could follow, and the business consequences that could result if it succeeds. This matters because good scenarios improve analysis, strengthen communication, support prioritization, and create a more stable basis for treatment decisions later in the risk process. They are neither dramatic fiction nor generic statements of concern. They are disciplined business stories built from evidence and context. When you learn to develop scenarios well, you are doing something central to C-risk thinking, because you are helping the organization see risk not as scattered technical noise, but as a set of plausible business situations that can be understood, compared, and managed with greater clarity and judgment.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.